Hello and welcome back. We are continuing our discussion about the software development models and continuing that discussion into the agile mindset. Today's lecture is going to focus on agile versus heavyweight process models. So we're talking about the software development lifecycle and sort of different ways in which we can utilize those different stages that we talked about in video 1.2 to sort of shape a project timeline and a project's development mapping. Okay, there we go. Cool. So I had mentioned this idea of waterfall and the waterfall methodology in my previous video when discussing the different stages of the software development lifecycle. Um, can't like easily move my head out of the way. Nope, thought I could, but I can't. Meow. There we go. Okay, so this is a classic model here. So we can see that we've got some pros and cons regarding this waterfall methodology. So each of those different stages that we talked about, each of the 6 stages are each listed over here. We can see we have planning, design, implementation, testing, release, and maintenance. So if you don't remember what these different stages are, go back to the previous video 1.2 and you can read about them. We can see that we have some pros and cons regarding this model. So in this model, each stage is focused on and completed before we move on to the next stage. So all the planning for a given application is done upfront ahead of time. The conversation is going to happen with the client or whomever's making those decisions. And then after that's completed, we'll go and we'll take those requirements and make a design. And then once the design has been approved, we can go ahead and start the implementation on it. Once the implementation is finished, then QA gets the entire finished package. They're going to go ahead and do their testing, their verification. Once that's all completed and passed, we will go ahead and release. And then after the release, we enter maintenance mode. So some pretty obvious pros are that there is a very clear structure here. We understand that when a decision is made, it is final. As a developer, it's nice to have that sort of guaranteed structure and that guaranteed rules environment that when I'm given a design, I can just implement it. I don't have to worry about decisions being made later or investing a lot of time and effort into a design only for it to change. So having that clear structure is definitely a pro. And of course, this is great for contracts. So if we have contracts that we have to, like contract workers, or you are a contract worker, being given this kind of model is very helpful because you can kind of map out and cost, you know, schedule and cost plan how long it will take to finish something, how much it will cost for you to do the implementation of something, things like that. Okay, now under the cons column, it's a different story, right? So if we look here under the cons column, we can see that changing requirements becomes very challenging. And a lot of work that we do these days do have changing requirements. Think, for example, in the 2020 pandemic, health requirements and rules were constantly changing. And so there was all of this turnover and changing of rules and new information being found. And that constant turnover doesn't work well if they had to sort of set out the rules in March 2020 and that's it. No other changes can be made until the end of the pandemic. That would not have gone over particularly well, right? We can see that a waterfall model probably wouldn't have worked with the way that things were done in the 2020 pandemic. Now, we can also see that very little work can be done concurrently. So that means that we don't really need a developer team until the design has been approved and all the planning has been done. And then once those two things are done, we don't need those teams anymore. So we don't really have this concurrent workflow. It means that maybe after you're done, once the business analysts are done planning a project, they move on to the next project. Their brain's not thinking about the project anymore. They're no longer working on the same thing that the development team is working on. So if the development team does have questions, they don't really have anybody that they can ask uh, because those original workers have now gone on to work on other things. So what I'm going to ask you to do here, of course, I am at home and you are wherever you are. But I'm going to ask you to take a pause here and I want you to think about when might this methodology work. We just sort of established that the idea of a waterfall mentality would not have worked during the 2020 pandemic because of constantly changing rules and regulations and protocols and safety measures and information available. So that would be a situation when it wouldn't work. But can we think of any when it would? So you take a pause here and think about it. Now, I hope you did that. I won't know, but I hope you did. Instead, we can now talk about when it does work. So here's some examples of situations when it would work. Stable, well understood, well-defined projects is a great example of when this works, right? It's not necessarily that these are waterfalls bad. Many people will tell you that waterfall's bad, but it's not. It's just sort of situational. If we think, for example, about payroll and taxes and income taxes, the rules that are defined by the government regarding, filing your taxes, many of those rules have been in place forever. And the changes in those rules come at very predefined times. It's not something that can change throughout the year. It only changes at very predefined times, which means waterfall would actually work really well here. We have sort of a predefined idea of when changes might come. We can take those changes and design for them. Once we have them, we can really schedule and timeline ourselves out. Same thing with like avionics. So hopefully we don't have things like airplane safety changing very often, right? So the same kind of idea fits here as well, that lots of that stuff was created and it's stable, it's well understood, it's structured, and there's no need for us to worry about changing it. And so we don't, right? It's this idea if it ain't, it's not really the idea if it ain't broke, don't fix it, but it is sort of that idea of we understand the scope of what we're dealing with already, and there's no reason for us to introduce more dynamic changes or the ability to make dynamic changes, right? Most of this course, although I haven't said it yet, is going to be it depends. So like most of this course, waterfall works in some situations. It just depends. So a lot of the things that we talk about in this course are sort of opportunities for us to ingest information and add them, think about them as sort of adding tools to our toolbox. So it's not that this is something that you're going to use every time. It's not even something that you will use at all potentially, but it's something that we want to know about so that if the situation arises, we understand that there is processes and protocols that we can use that will help make the situation successful should waterfall be a good fit. So that was our heavyweight process, and now we're going to switch over and talk about our lightweight process. It's kind of a smaller picture here, but we'll do our best to be able to see it. Now, when we're talking about a lightweight process, we're talking about a process that, get my little pointer out here, right there, will favor flexibility and team autonomy. So this favors the ability for teams to sort of do what they need to do when they're doing it. And that's very important for us. We also want to recognize that in a lightweight process, rather than this very large waterfall cascading downward, instead we have these very short feedback cycles. So what that means is we implement small little pieces and we can get feedback right away. So we kind of have that loop going on there where we get that feedback right away. The cons for this is that it can be very expensive. This does mean that groups are working concurrently. This does mean that we're having lots of meetings to have these discussions, to discuss different ways to solve problems and what might be better and listening to people's perspectives. So it's more lightweight, it's more agile, it's easier for things to shift around, right? If we think about like a feather being lightweight, it only takes a very slight breeze for that feather to shift around. Um, but we can potentially make very meaningful changes at any point during the process, which is a huge pro. All right. Actually, I'll go back for one more second. And can I like zoom in on this? I can't really zoom in on it. We're going to go through this picture a little bit more shortly, but I will just say that what we can see here is that a product vision still does sort of exist. Um, and what happens, this is mostly a development life cycle here without uh, any predefined stages, because within each of these stages, within each of these sort of remarks here, all the stages are occurring. So this idea of a product vision can encompass both the planning and the behavior, right? The design of it. This idea of a product backlog or planning meetings. These planning meetings might be about planning what behaviors are most important to the client, but they also can be planning meetings around what is feasible to be done in a certain amount of time, right? And so we can take all of the things we know our client wants, we can figure out how we're going to prioritize and plan them, we can implement them and get them done in what's called a sprint or an iteration. These typically are anywhere from, this says 2 to 4 weeks, but 1 to 4 weeks is perfectly reasonable. And every 1 to 4 weeks, we meet again and we show what we have finished. We often have demos. We can talk about what's changed, what's different, any obstacles we came up against, and go back and start planning again and making different changes. So we do end up having lots of these meetings, and this can happen any number of times before we're ready for release and deployment, which comes out over here. Who actually defines how many sprints we're going to have before a release and deployment? It varies. And it's often a place of large contention when we're dealing with more lightweight processes is, what even is a deadline and how do we meet deadlines when we're living in this lightweight process where, a feather can blow in the wind and change the whole direction. So with that in mind, we do see that we have this spectrum of approaches. These are not all of the approaches when it comes to implementations of the software development lifecycle stages, but there are some sort of tried and true methodologies that people talk about and focus on. So here at the most rigid end, we have a waterfall methodology as we've discussed. And then here on the opposite end, so we have rigid right here, and here on the opposite end, on what I have deemed the loosey-goosey end, is the Kanban board. We don't do Kanban board in this class, but it's basically an idea of one big board of all the things that need to get done, and we're just picking them off one at a time until they're all done. Stack-based, basically, with occasional prioritization of our board, is the general idea. But what we can see is there is this um, spectrum of approaches to software development. And it brings us back to that idea of it depends, right? It depends on the team and the projects, and lots of other factors that we'll talk about in just a second. So here it is. How do we pick a process? So, I've introduced now this idea of featherweight, lightweight processes, the most rigid, heavyweight process that we know being waterfall, and how do we know where we should fall on this spectrum? So sort of take a minute to consider some characteristics or points that you might want to consider when deciding on what would be the best process for your product, for your team, for your company. Pause. Okay. I won't really take a long pause there, but hopefully you did. So we have a couple different things that we can sort of consider, a couple different factors. We have something like our project size that we can consider. Really, really big projects might need lots of planning. I really like to think about like video games. So I think about like Skyrim and The Witcher. And while maybe they're very buggy and have like lots of funny glitches and whatever, the storylines are so full and so rich, and the way that stories and characters are interacting are so rich. That's a big project. Like that is not a small project to take on. Meanwhile, I have an app in the App Store that allows my children to scan their room looking for monsters under their bed. And for my daughter, who's very scared of monsters, I can turn the sensitivity all the way down and it finds no monsters and she goes to bed. And my son, who likes to find the silly monsters in his room, I turn the sensitivity all the way up and it finds silly monsters. That was a one-person project. The storylines are not very rich. It's quite a minimalistic application, to be honest, right? So we can see that different project sizes might have different requirements. Same thing with team dynamics and maturity. We're going to talk a lot more about team dynamics throughout the course, and we're going to talk more about sort of how teams go through phases and learn to work together. But understanding that people work differently, understanding that you may have some junior devs and some senior devs. You may have people who have a lot of technical experience or some that only have certain types of technical experience. Sort of understanding the dynamic of your team can help with that process selection. And lastly, in this list, we also have stakeholder requirements or stakeholder needs. Do they need a deadline? And have they picked it already? Is this more of an ongoing project where we have lots of time and lots of room to grow and change and shift? The things that our stakeholders, that the clients, that the managers of the world might need out of our problem, out of our product, pardon me, those are going to help us define where on this spectrum we fall with our development. So sometimes it's not in our control. It may not be something that we get to pick. It may be something that is sort of driven by external decisions as well. So I want you to just take a second here at the end of this video and pause and reflect and think about your last school project or assignment that you worked on. Perhaps it was in a second year project course or a databases course or HCI, or maybe it was just an individual assignment, right? Think back on the instructions that you were given and ask yourself, would you prefer clear step-by-step structure or that flexible, changeable plans? Many of us might say, we want that step-by-step structure because I want to know exactly what my instructor wants from me so that I can do that work and get a good grade, right? But in that clear, rigid, step-by-step structure, there is no deadline extensions, right? You can't ask for an extension because life happened, because you are in a step-by-step rigid structure. And then we have this idea of flexible, changeable plans. But maybe now deadlines are moving. Maybe the instructor is moving them. Maybe they're adding questions to the assignment, right? That sounds like, for me, pure chaos. Oh my gosh, I could not handle that. So what we see is on both ends of the spectrum, there are some intense extremes that could be a problem, right? So what kind of balance would you want to see achieved in your own work? And, what we'll explore is hopefully a nice balance when it comes to software development in the next video, called Agile. Hopefully you can sort of start to decipher the pieces of your own schoolwork and own projects that might require planning up front, but more availability and flexibility at the end. And if you're looking to take your thought process one step further, you should ask yourself, if you were the manager, if you are the instructor, um, would that work for you? Would it work for you to be told you need to give specific instructions up front, but then you're allowing your developer team or your students to kind of willy-nilly finish it when they can, right? Really try and get into those mindsets. I like to talk about it like wearing different hats. Take off your student hat and put on your instructor hat. And now ask, would you rather be providing clear instructions or have those flexibilities? Try and really think about it from different perspectives because it's going to help your project along quite a bit. Okay, so with that, we are all done with this idea of heavyweight versus lightweight processes, and we're going to continue to explore the idea of the lightweight processes and specifically the one that you're going to look at in your project in my next video. Cool. Okay, thank you everyone, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.